Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle, and this is another video in my Agatha Christie read-through project. I'm going to share with you the most recent three Agatha Christie books that I have read. We have two Poirots, and sandwiched in the middle is a Miss Marple. So I always have a lot to say in these videos, so I'm just going to dive right in. Let me tell you how this is going to work. Whenever I talk about a book, I'm going to give a brief synopsis and then talk about certain Agatha Christie universe things that I noticed in the book, and possibly Shakespeare references as well, unless they're spoilery. And after that, I'm going to dive into the spoiler section where I really get into the plot, where I talk about clues that I've noticed, the structure of how she builds the mystery, and all of that stuff can be spoilery, so I save it for that section. I'm also going to talk about the investigative method because I've been tracking that in this read-through. And when it comes to Poirot, if I've noticed anything related to truth, then I track that too, because I've been noticing in the Poirot books that truth is really important to him, sometimes more important than justice, which I find very interesting. Okay, so let's dive straight in, and I will warn you when I'm going to hit the spoilery section, and I will have spoiler written on the screen. So if it's an Agatha Christie that you have not yet read, then just fast forward the video until you don't see spoiler on the screen anymore. Okay, let's dive straight in with Mrs. McGinty's Dead. This is a Poirot that she wrote in 1952. Now, I've been looking at Agatha Christie's Complete Secret Notebooks by John Curran. I read the section on the book after I finished it, but I noticed that he also has really good synopsises. So I'm going to read his synopsis of Mrs. McGinty's Dead. At the request of Superintendent Spence, Poirot agrees to reinvestigate the murder of charwoman Mrs. McGinty, found battered to death 2 months earlier. Although James Bentley has been convicted of her murder, someone in Broadhinny is ready to kill again. And yet they are all very nice people. So Mrs. McGinty's Dead. Mrs. McGinty is the name of the main character, but this is another nursery rhyme book. Agatha Christie loved to write books around nursery rhymes, and there was one about a Mrs. McGinty, and one of the verses goes like this: Mrs. McGinty's dead. How did she die? Down on one knee, just like I. Mrs. McGinty's dead. How did she die? Holding out her hand, just like I. So this is a nursery rhyme, but I would say this is more of a game that children would play, because they would act out the actions, I think. Mrs. McGinty's dead. How did she die? Like this. I can totally see kids enjoying that. Okay, so in this book, we have a number of interesting universe things. Superintendent Spence is introduced right from the beginning, and we saw him earlier in Taken at the Flood from 1948. We also have Ariadne Oliver, and I love whenever she shows up in a Poirot book. She's a fantastic character. We first met her in the Parker Pyne Investigates book, but she was also in Cards on the Table. A further universe thing is Hastings does not appear in this book, but Poirot reminisces about Hastings on page 6. If only, he thought, Sir Hastings were available. He dwelt with pleasure on his remembrances of his old friend. My first friend in this country, and still to me the dearest friend I have. So yeah, so it was nice to see Hastings referred to, even if he doesn't appear in the book. And I don't think that there is any Shakespeare that I picked up on in this book. Now, I don't always pick up on it because I have not read all of Shakespeare's plays. So unless it's pretty obvious, I might miss it. But as far as I can see, there's no Shakespeare in this one. Okay, so we are going to now dive into some of the clues and the structure. I love looking at how Agatha Christie builds her mystery, the framework and the structure. So we're going to dive into that now with Mrs. McGinty's Dead. And so I am going to put spoiler across the screen. If you've not read this yet, then you might want to fast forward. All right, so let's dive into this. As far as investigative method goes, on page 6, we read, everything Hercule Poirot decided was too artistic nowadays. Nowhere was there the love of order and method that he himself prized so highly. And that is totally true. Order and method. Those are the two big words. If you're looking at what Poirot's investigative method is, it is order and method. And then on page 157, to arrange with order and precision, order and method, that was the thing, order and method. So, I mean, that's just highlighted in here. Okay, so now let's dive into the clues and the structure and that kind of thing. The fact that Mrs. McGinty's Dead is a children's game is described for the reader on page 9. We used to play it when we were kids, a lot of us in a row, question and answer all down the line. Mrs. McGinty's dead. How did she die? Down on one knee, just like I. And then the next question, Mrs. McGinty's dead. How did she die? Holding out her hand, just like I. And there we'd all be, all kneeling and our right arms held out stiff. And then you got it. Mrs. McGinty's dead. How did she die? Like this. Smack, the top of the row would fall sideways and down we all went like a pack of 9 pins. 9 pins. So that's Spence, in Superintendent Spence, describing the game. On page 26, I picked up on what could be a possible motive for the crime. Maureen says, of course, she snooped a bit. So I always look at the character of the victim to give clues for motive when I'm reading Agatha Christie. Well, and when I read mysteries in general, that's true. Oh, this is just a note that I wrote. Spence doesn't think that James did it, which is why he goes to see Poirot in the first place. The reader is naturally very curious to meet James, but Christie holds him back. We know Poirot had an interview with him, but we weren't invited. We didn't see that interview that Poirot had with James in prison. The first glimpse we get is Poirot remembering it on page 38, and even then it's just his looks and demeanor. So Poirot does remember that interview, but all we get is him remembering what James looked like and his demeanor. James has yet to speak. And then for truth, there is some of that in here highlighted for us. The truth is very important to Poirot, but he is more than happy to lie for the sake of the investigation. So I picked this up. Here's the quote. Poirot, never hindered by a pedantic regard for truth, launched out into speech, and that's on page 34. Then he uttered that lie without a blush. To his mind, it was a very necessary lie, and that's on page 38. So for Poirot, it's lying in order to reveal truth, and that's why it's okay for him. I thought that was really interesting. And then we finally hear from James himself on page 40. However briefly, I noted, Poirot is remembering his interview again. And then truth again, what monstrous lies he had told that day. Never mind, they were necessary. That was on page 41. And then here's some follow-up. Into Poirot's mind, there came back a remembrance. Maureen Summerhay's careless voice saying, of course she snooped. Of course she snooped round a bit. Mrs. McGinty had snapped. She was honest, but she liked to know about things, and people kept things, foolish, sentimental, meaningless things from the past. and that's on page 59. So I was totally right to highlight that as a characteristic of Mrs. McGinty. Oh, I forgot to mention in the universe section, there is a reference to cards on the table on page 73. And then on page 88, Poirot says, "My friend Hastings, he was romantic and sentimental. Me, never. Me, I am severely practical." All right, and then some more clues and that area. "Very nice people lived in Broadhinny. My postmistress said so, and nice people like to preserve their niceness." This is Poirot on page 89. And again, this goes to motive. Niceness has been mentioned before. And I do think that goes to motive. And then on page 90, Poirot says, "I can't see Robin Upward committing a murder for respectability or devotion, or in fact for anything but a good solid gain to Robin Upwood." It's interesting as it comes not long after the discussion of niceness as a motive. Robin Upwood's motive is the opposite of niceness. So I thought that was interesting. And then on page 91, we have someone trying to push Poirot under a train. And I thought that this was very interesting because instances of personal violence toward Poirot is very rare, which is interesting considering that he investigates murders, but it doesn't happen very often. And this was a significant instance of personal violence. I also had a note here saying that Christie doesn't get enough credit for the humor in her books. She's funny. And so I noticed that in here. Like, there's not a ton of it and there's not a lot of laugh out loud, ha ha, but there are definitely moments, and I don't think that Agatha Christie gets enough credit for her humor. Again, some possible motives, things that I noticed that are popping up: adoption, nature versus nurture, and heredity, which I thought was going to be important to the story. And then we finally meet James himself on page 136. So I thought that was interesting because he's the guy who's been arrested for this murder, but he really plays a very minor role in the book. Here's another one with regard to truth. "I think I know the truth, though there is one fact that baffles me utterly." Poirot says that on page 169. And then I loved that it ends with a gathering of the suspects. I love that in Agatha Christie. They happen most often in Poirot. But I love that where all the suspects are gathered together in one room and Poirot just lays it out and reveals the murderer. And I am a big fan of that trope. I really, really love it. So, Mrs. McGinty's dead. I gave it 4 stars. I did really enjoy it. But what's interesting is that I enjoyed it and it's got 4 stars, but it's sitting at number 29 right now on my rankings list, and I have so far read 58 Agatha Christie's and it's sitting at 29. And that's because there are so many that I have given 4 stars to. So within that, I have to decide, where I rank it within the 4-star grouping. So yeah, I really did enjoy Mrs. McGinty's Dead. I think this is what I was referring to when I was talking about some of Agatha Christie's humor. When Poirot meets Ariadne Oliver, when he realizes that she's in the village, Poirot paused a moment at the gate to pass a hand over his mustaches. And as he did so, a car came twisting slowly down the hill, and an apple core directed with force struck him on the cheek. Startled, Poirot let out a yelp of protest. The car halted and a head came through the window. "I'm so sorry. Did I hit you?" I love that. All right, so that's Mrs. McGinty's Dead. Let me know in the comment section down below if you've read Mrs. McGinty's Dead and what your thoughts were on it. Like I said, I did really enjoy that. Now it's time to move on to Miss Marple in They Do It with Mirrors. This is from 1952, and I'm going to talk about this book in the same way previously. So I'm going to give a brief synopsis, and if there's any universe stuff or just general Miss Marple things that are unspoilery. I'm going to start there, and then I'm going to move into a spoiler section, and so again I will put spoilers on the screen. If you have never read, they do it with mirrors. So here is the synopsis from John Curran's book. Miss Marple goes to Stonygates, the reform home for young delinquents run by the husband of her childhood friend, Carrie Louise. Although the atmosphere is tense when murder is committed, the victim is totally unexpected. More deaths follow before Miss Marple penetrates the murderer's conjuring trick. So I do love Miss Marple, but I have to confess this one is not my favorite Miss Marple, but I did enjoy it. There is this fantastic description of Miss Marple on pages 7 and 8. But first, I liked this. There is this plan of Stonygates that you get at the front. I love that when there's maps in a book. Miss Marple was white-haired, with a soft pink and white wrinkled face and innocent china blue eyes. She looked a very sweet old lady. Nobody would have called Mrs. Van Rydyck a sweet old lady. So I love this, that she's got these innocent blue eyes, but I love the phrasing, it's that she looked a very sweet old lady. That maybe that is not entirely true. There is some Shakespeare in this on page 11, just like Desdemona and Othello, only fortunately there was no Iago about to mess things up. All right. And then there's another reference to Shakespeare right towards the end. Marple calls Gina Kate, and Gina says she'll call you Petruchio in a moment, and that's from The Taming of the Shrew. All right, so let's get into this. I am going to put spoiler now across the screen as we get into some of the clues and motives and structures and just things that I noticed in They Do It with Mirrors. So Carrie Louise as a character, on page 10, it's mentioned about her ideals and that she has a tendency to marry cranks. And the person who says that is her sister, and by cranks she means people with ideals. So ideals is a huge part of Carrie Louise's character, and it's important to note that she marries people with ideals. It seems to me that that's going to be important moving forward in the mystery on page 12. And what Carrie Louise does next but marry this man, Louis Sericold, another crank, another man with ideals. So it's important to know, you learn this in the story, that Carrie Louise has married 3 times, and they are all men with ideals, and her most recent husband is another man with ideals. And then we get some investigative method by Miss Marple. Because you've got a nose for that sort of thing. You always had. You've always been a sweet, innocent looking creature, Jane, and all the time underneath, nothing has even surprised you. You always believe the worst. And that's Mrs. Van Rydyck, who is Carrie Louise's sister. She says that on page 14. And then again, human nature, dear, is very much the same everywhere. It is more difficult to observe it closely in a city, that is all. Ms. Marple says that on page 16. And so her human nature, her understanding of human nature is a huge part of her investigative method and why she's so good at investigating mysteries. She understands human nature, and she does always believe the worst in people. So she is rarely deceived. She's rarely tricked by people. And then on page 21, Miss Marple looked gratefully at him, a charming, helpless old lady with, if he had chanced to notice it, very shrewd blue eyes. So that's another great description of Miss Marple that also highlights her investigative method and what she's like, that she is shrewd. We have this character called Edgar Lawson, who is part of this reform school. His voice had an unexpectedly dramatic quality about it, as though the utterance of her name were the first words of a part he was playing in amateur theatricals. So this was on page 21. So even right from the close to the beginning of the book, there's this theme that comes up of playing a part, of theatricals, of plays is a huge part of this book. And it's important to the story, to understanding and trying to solve the mystery. And again, the impression was not wholly convincing. It had a theatrical flavor. 22, page 22. And then that Miss Marple noticed that he was trying to be important, again acting, and there was again the faint insinuation that a busy and important man had very charmingly put important affairs to one side out of chivalry to his employer's wife. And then we have another character called Steve Risterick. He runs the dramatics at Stonygate. So again, like that, even just dramatics as a whole is important at this location. We encourage all the artistic instincts, Carrie Louise says that on page 31. So that means to me, this early in the book, I'm thinking that things are not going to be as they seem. People may not be who they say they are. So it's really important to pay close attention and to notice if anything is said about whether someone is maybe acting, or where what you're getting is theatricals rather than the truth. So my antenna has pinged. Louis Sericold, Carrie Louise's current husband, his work is more important than people. I picked that up as I was reading. So that's part of his character. And again, probably goes to his ideals, that work seems more important to him than people. Jolly Belliver is very devoted to Carrie Louise and would do anything for her. And that's a character, it says that on page 56. So she's like almost like a nurse or a companion for Carrie Louise. So again, that's important to note when you get stuff like that someone would do anything for somebody, someone's very devoted, that could be important. An idealist, yes, that is so. And therefore, it may be that she does not truly appreciate the evil that there is in the world. Gulbranson, who comes to visit, who is the son of Carrie Louise's first husband, he says that about Carrie Louise on page 58. So we do know that she's an idealist. That has come up again. And because of that, people think that she doesn't truly appreciate the evil that there is in the world. And so it's important to note that, because as we learn, that's not accurate. And so people who think they know Carrie Louise really well, it turns out maybe they don't. Edgar Lawson came into the big dim hall with the air of a star performer making a triumphal entry. Again, that's page 66. So I think it's really important that whenever we see Edgar Lawson, we get these notes of him performing and theatricals. And that's going to be really important for later in the story. And again, it talks about him striking an attitude or saying something theatrically. Agatha Christie is really nailing the hammering the nail on the head here, that you need to pay attention to Edgar Lawson. There is no need to worry, Gina. Edgar loves Louis. He's just dramatizing himself. That's all. And that's from Carrie Louise on page 68. But it was not Edgar who opened it. It was Louis Sericold. He was breathing hard as though he'd been running, but otherwise he was unmoved. And that's on page 70. So we get this big dramatic scene that happens. Edgar and Louis go into his office and close the door, and everybody else is in the room outside, and they can hear what's happening inside, but they can't see it, and that's key. And so when the door opens after this dramatic scene in which they hear gunshots, Louis Sericold is breathing heavily. Why? Why is he breathing heavily? I think is key to notice that. The sound of gunshot, but further away. So the first time they hear it, they hear the sound of a gunshot, but it sounds farther away, not in the room. Then a few minutes and 2 more gunshots come from the study. Here's a quote from Alex regarding Marple. It was as though he had found some unwanted prop on a stage set. Again, with theatricals, acting, stage, really interesting. So difficult, isn't it, to be clear about anything, I mean, because if you're looking at one thing, you can't be looking at another. And one so often looks at the wrong thing, though whether because one happens to do so or because you're meant to, it's very hard to say. Misdirection, the conjurers call it. So clever, aren't they? And that's, Marple says that in her first interview with Inspector Curry on page 84. It's interesting to me that she notes that right from the beginning, that there is some kind of conjurer's trick that has happened. The murder happens during this big scene where Edgar and Mr. Lawson are locked in the study. Gulbranson is killed in his room. It was all so dramatic, you know, Marple again in that same interview. And then again, here are some descriptions of Marple, which I found fascinating. Innocent china blue eyes met his. She's old, but she's sharp. She's a shrewd old bird. I think that's great. Louis Sercold handed evidence to the inspector. The letter, he took it out of the typewriter and it was in his pocket and he gave it to the inspector. And a sample of the medicine. He didn't let the inspector see the bottle itself. He gave him a sample. So right away, I was extremely suspicious of Louis Sercold because he is managing the evidence that the inspector gets, and that is always suspicious. The inspector interviewing Alex, he heard 3 shots and running footsteps. Who was running? And at what point in those shots did he hear the footsteps? I thought, you know, again, key clue. I loved it. It was so ham and, you know, and so madly theatrical. Everything Edgar does is always ridiculous. One can't take him seriously for a moment. And that's Gina on page 125. What is it the young people say? Putting on an act? That's what I felt it was. Edgar's only a boy. He was being melodramatic and silly and fancying himself as a bold, desperate character, seeing himself as the wronged hero in a romantic story. I was quite sure he would never fire that revolver. That's Carrie Louise on page 146. And then in a conversation again between the inspector and Alex on page 157, the illusion is in the eye of the beholder, not in the set itself. All right, and then here's another little look into Marple's investigative method. Like Johnny Backhouse, thought Miss Marple, who always had a good storehouse of parallels to draw upon, selected from inhabitants of St. Mary Mead. And this is totally true. This is a big part of how she investigates, and it's directly connected to her understanding of human nature, is she has observed events in her village, and she observes how people behave and what the results and consequences are. And then she compares that to the current events. That is totally how she investigates, because she understands people. And then finally, the last thing that I noticed here when I was looking at clues and stuff, he was always theatrical. And that's Marple referring to Edgar Lawson at the very end of the book, where we find out that it was all just an act. What was going on in that study was all just an act. I did enjoy, they do it with mirrors. I gave it 4 stars. It's not my favorite Marple, but I did enjoy it. And it is currently ranked 37 on my rankings list of, right now I've read 58 books and it's sitting at number 37. Okay, let's dive into the last one, and that is another Poirot, After the Funeral. I adore this edition. I'm so glad that I found it. Okay, so let's start with the synopsis from John Curran's Secret Notebooks. At the family reunion following the funeral of Richard Abernethy, Cora Langsquinet makes an unguarded remark about his death. But he was murdered, wasn't he? When she is savagely killed the following day, it would seem that her suspicions were justified. This is a Poirot from 1953, and this is another one of Agatha Christie's books that is really all the characters are just in one family. It is a family mystery, a very complicated one, however, and so there's this really important family genealogy map at the beginning, which is really important because it can be really it's really complicated and difficult possibly for the reader to keep all of the characters and their relationships to each other straight. We are introduced to the characters through the thoughts of the butler, Lanscombe, and the lawyer, and Mr. Entwistle, which I think is really a really interesting way to introduce the characters to the reader. Both of those people, the butler, Lanscombe, and the lawyer, Mr. Entwistle, are remembering these characters, and that's how the reader is first introduced to them. There is a great some great universe stuff in here. So George the valet makes an appearance in this book, and also Mr. Goby. He runs a private investigation service, and we last saw him in The Mystery of the Blue Train in 1928. That was his first appearance. And then years and years and years later, he appears again. Poirot goes to see Mr. Goby for some information, and I thought that was fascinating. All right, let's dive into the spoilery section because most of my notes are related to that. Before I do though, this is a good Poirot. He makes an early appearance. He's got a big part of this story. He enters in on page 56 when Entwistle consults him. And so I do like that in a Poirot when he's, in the story for a good amount of time. Same with Marple. Okay, so let's dive in here. First of all, this is one of Agatha Christie's bloodier murders. She doesn't often have, really graphic murders, but in this one, Cora is murdered with a hatchet. Yikes! And there's blood in there. Yeah, so it's a bloody one for Agatha Christie. She was not in any sense an intellectual woman. This is Entwistle speaking. No, perhaps not. But she was very shrewd, Mr. Entwistle. Really very shrewd. It quite surprised me sometimes how she managed to hit the nail on the head. And that's Gilchrist talking to Entwistle on page 30. So again, I thought this was key right from the beginning. We need to learn about the character of the victim. And in here, it seems like she is not very intellectual, but she is shrewd. That was always the awkward thing about Cora. When truth would have been better left unspoken, she spoke it. And that's Entwistle on page 59. Again, the character of the victim, that she speaks the truth, even when it probably should be left unsaid. I noted in Mrs. McGinty's Dead that Agatha Christie doesn't get enough credit for her humor, and again, I noticed that in here, she's really funny, and so you get like these little moments like this one, and Poirot twirled his mustaches with enormous energy. I just thought that was hilarious. Another reference to Cora's shrewdness on page 70. Richard is muttering out loud about her shrewdness. Cora was never discreet, and she enjoyed, how shall I put it, showing how sharp she could be. Like a child who's got hold of somebody's secret. If Cora got hold of a secret, she'd want to talk about it. Even if she promised not to, she'd still do it. She wouldn't be able to help herself. And that's Mr. Guthrie on page 82. Again, the victim's character. or calling as nuns. Mr. Goby, speaking of his agents on page 100, to Miss Gilchrist. Miss Gilchrist mentioned a nun coming to the door to collect for something the same day that Susan Banks arrived. So there's this, it keeps coming up of these nuns coming to the door to collect. So it made me wonder, are they actually nuns? Is there someone dressing as a nun because they're trying to get into the house? Yeah, it just made me curious. The scene between Mr. Poirot and Mr. Goby is hilarious because Mr. Goby is not able to look at Poirot. Like, he can't look at people in the eye. So as they're having this discussion, it goes on for pages. You get these moments of where Mr. Goby's eyes are because he's not looking at Poirot, and it's just hilarious. Mr. Goby shook his head severely at the radiator. Mr. Goby emphasized the last point by nodding his head significantly at a cushion on the sofa. It was just so funny. And then at the very end of that scene was also hilarious. Mr. Goby brought his glance across to rest apologetically on Poirot's polished patent leather shoe, the nearest he had come to a direct encounter, and murmured, "I'm afraid I can't say that, Mr. Poirot." It's just such a funny little bit about that guy's character. It didn't need to be in there for the story, but it was hilarious. All right, again, nuns calling for a subscription. Lanscombe referring to the day before Richard died, nuns called. So again, like, what's the deal with that? Again, on page 123 at Timothy and Maud's, Miss Gilchrist answers the door, and it's nuns calling again. There's a comment made between Susan and George about their cousin Rosamond being shrewd like Aunt Cora. And so I picked up on that right away, and I thought we need to pay attention to Rosamond and what she might know and what she says and is choosing not to say. It's rare for Poirot to investigate this much incognito. On page, when I wrote that, I was on page 141 out of 192, and the family still doesn't know who he is. He goes to talk to all the family members, and he pretends to be somebody else. Like, he does so much of his investigating in this book incognito, in disguise, and he doesn't do that very often. I found it really interesting why he felt that was necessary, rather than just saying, "I'm a detective, I need to ask you some questions." Nuns again. Poirot and Miss Gilchrist are talking about what made her afraid at Maud's, and she said she thinks that it was the nun. So what's going on there? And then some investigative method stuff. More or less forgotten by all, Hercule Poirot leant back in his chair, sipped his coffee, and observed, as a cat may observe, the twitterings and comings and goings of a flock of birds. The cat is not ready yet to make its spring. I liked that. So, but that's totally how he investigates. He observes what's going on. It's silly, you know, but I got quite a turn when I was at Mrs. Abernathy's and a nun came to the door collecting. I got it into my head she was the same as a nun who came to the door on the day of the inquest to poor Mrs. Lansquenet at Lynchet St. Mary. I felt, you know, almost as though she had been following me around. So again, what's with the nuns? Is this a clue or is this a red herring? So then I started to think, if it is someone dressed up as a nun in order to gain access to take something, I was thinking to myself, it could be Rosamond. But then I was thinking, it didn't have to be a woman. It could be a guy dressing as a nun. So it could be Michael or George. Then follows a discussion about how one very seldom looks properly at anyone and how nobody ever sees themselves as they appear to other people on page 150. This feels like an important conversation, and it does. It turns out to be really important. And I have to confess, this is something that I completely missed in the story. I didn't get the importance of this, which is why I didn't guess the killer in this case. Rosamond is the first to clock Poirot as a detective on page 151. So previously I had said I was on page 141 and they still didn't know that he was a detective. Again, investigative method. But if I am right, thought Poirot, and after all, it is natural to me to be right. It is a habit I have. Then there is no need to go into who was here and who was there. First, I must seek a proof where I have deduced the proof may be, and then I make my little speech and I sit back and see what happens. And then there is something related to truth. Oh no, this is Shakespeare. Oh, this is interesting. I do not, I trust, disturb an Ophelia, said Poirot as he took his seat beside her. You are perhaps studying the role. I've never played in Shakespeare, said Rosamond, except once in Rep. I was Jessica in The Merchant, a lousy part, yet not without its pathos, Poirot says. I am never merry when I hear sweet music. What a load she carried, poor Jessica, the daughter of the hated and despised Jew. What doubts of herself she must have had when she brought with her father's ducats when she ran away to her lover. Jessica with gold was one thing. Jessica without gold might have been another. So that is, of course, some deep dive there into The Merchant of Venice, which is a play that I haven't yet read. This Poirot also has a gathering of the suspects, which I love. I remember Cora tilting her head. So this is what comes out when it's revealed that it was never Cora, it was Miss Gilchrist. But I don't remember a specific direction being stated. I totally missed that. So if it is in there, I completely missed that there was a direction, right or left, into how she tilted her head. I remember reading that Cora had this habit of tilting her head like a bird, but I totally missed that it had a specific direction. And that was the key to it, because Maud remembers that there was something wrong, but she couldn't think what it was until she looked into her mirror and she remembered that the Cora after the funeral tilted her head the wrong way. I also missed that Miss Gilchrist could not have seen the flowers on the malachite table unless she was there before. Again, another huge clue I completely missed. I was so focused on the nuns that turned out to be not really that important. Again, this is how brilliant Agatha Christie is, right? One last investigative method thing. It shows you, madam, the dangers of conversation. It is a profound belief of mine that if you can induce a person to talk to you for long enough on any subject whatever, sooner or later they give themselves away. Miss Gilchrist did. Again, I really enjoyed After the Funeral. I did not figure it out. There were some big clues there that I just missed. Again, Agatha Christie is just brilliant, you know, like there's so much in there, and she puts her important clues, she hides them in conversation or paragraphs of description, and I missed them. But I did really enjoy this one, and I gave it 4 stars, and it's currently sitting at number 31 out of 58 on my rankings list. Okay, so this was another big video. They always are when I do my Agatha Christie read-through project videos. But let me know in the comment section down below if you have read any of these. After the Funeral, They Do It with Mirrors, or Mrs. McGinty's Dead. You know I love to talk about Agatha Christie, and I love to talk about books with you, and so let's chat in the comment section down below, and I will see you for another video soon. Bye.